It became the perception.
If the Communist Party was responsible, Western diplomats could not understand why it would mount such an ineffective operation.
I would have said it made no sense at that time because the communists were moving very effectively. They were achieving their objectives by other means. And I would have said, why in the heck should they mount a coup?
It was known that the murders were carried out by junior army officers calling themselves the 30th of September movement. But the question of who, if anyone, was pulling the strings behind these officers was much less certain. Nevertheless, the diplomatic cables do reveal the West was keen for Suharto and the army to drive home its advantage in this brutal Cold War struggle.
In the 3 or 4 weeks following the putsch, Norman Redaway put together a radio program which was then sent back into Jakarta and broadcast to Indonesian people, in the Indonesian language, of course, purporting to be an Indonesian-sourced program. They were putting back a highly colored version of the story that Suharto and his men were putting about.
The British-made propaganda program called The Voices from the Well was broadcast from a radio station set up next door to Suharto's house. The army set up a new tabloid to spread stories of the bestiality of the PKI. They emphasized that women will sink to utmost depravity under the godless communist influence.
It didn't have to take great skills for the army to whip up sentiments against the communists. At the same time, I think the whole party was still left in the lurch because they still were in the mode of the parliamentary road to power. So they were essentially defenseless and armed without arms. Exactly the situation Aidit was worried about.
Chairman Aidit, the communist leader, went on the run in Central Java, telling people to defy the accusations against him by carrying on as usual. It was advice that would prove fatal for many. PKI members in President Sukarno's cabinet were arrested, and other senior leaders secretly executed. Sukarno was rapidly losing his grip on power. He appealed for calm, but was powerless to protect the Communist Party he had courted for so many years.
After the 30th, when we heard about the rebels, we had very many books from Leninism, Marxism, and so on. My husband said that we must burn it.
Mobs of students hit the streets in protest against the PKI. The army supplied them with lists of targets to be attacked. The Communist Party headquarters was the first to be destroyed.
As time went on, we saw that the anti-Sukarno factions of students gained in strength and importance, and of course they were manipulated and steered by the army. I often saw army officers talking with or conferring with students, letting them know how far they could go that day.
From far, I saw a fire and saw so many people crying, exciting, and so on. And I said to my driver, oh, stop, saying, you must, we should drive on.
Dr. Sumiasi was coming home from work when she saw her house in flames.
Did you ever go back to your house, or was that the last?
Oh, no, not anymore to my house. It's already destroyed by the 2 or 3 trucks hired by group of Suharto.
Dr. Sumiasi and her husband left their 3 children with relatives and fled. Carmel Budiarjo lost her job as a translator in the Indonesian Foreign Office almost immediately. As suspected communists, Carmel and her husband were arrested by the military.
I was sitting in this small room on the side here, and the soldiers came in and they asked for me. That's where I was arrested, in the front room. When we were sitting in this jeep taking us out of town, the fellow who was in charge, he said, you have to blindfold. And that completely destroyed me, because I just couldn't understand why they were doing this. So I became hysterical then. And of course you always have the worst idea of what was going to happen. You know, going to be taken off and shot or something like that.
She was to spend 4 years as a political prisoner. In the capital city, even people with the most tenuous links to the PKI are arrested en masse. With the names of party members being given under torture, the net gets wider and wider. Dr. Sumiasi and her husband are caught on the run.
When Suroso called me for an interrogation, and he is very, very cruel, he said, are you a member of the PKI? Oh, no. Are you doctor of the CC? I am not a member. How can I be a doctor of that?
As the wife of a party member, she was threatened with electric shock torture when she would not cooperate.
Oh, my heart beat it so hard, maybe that somebody can hear how hard it was. Then I blew him on his stomach. Hey, Pak Sana, don't do it, Pak. Don't do it. Please don't do it. Why? I am electrophile. What's that? Electrophile. Electrophile, I can die when you give me. Oh, it's very, very low. Although it's low, how low it is, I can die. And when I am dead, my spirit will strangle you.
With his balancing policy in ruins and under pressure from the military, President Sukarno appoints General Suharto as the new head of the army.
I, President, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces of the Republic of Indonesia, appoint Major General Suharto. I appoint him as Minister, Commander of the Army.
Now in official control of the army, General Suharto plans the systematic destruction of the Communist Party. He immediately dispatches his para-commando troops to Central Java. Here they purge any army officers sympathetic to the PKI. The army then turns its attention to alleged communist sympathizers all over Indonesia.
As long as there is still one communist in Indonesia, I think we still have a military operation against this one person.
Well, Suharto gave the orders to clean up everything, to every commander who was under his organization. So this is what I did. I ordered all my people to send patrols out and captured everybody in the PKI post.
Captured PKI leaders at first stuck to their principles of keep your mouth shut or you don't know anything, can't do anything, and don't understand anything. But the operations has found an efficient answer to these slogans by launching the drive of surrender, support the government, or die.
The district of Prambanan, known for its 1,000-year-old Hindu temple, was one of the first to feel the wrath of Suharto's ideological cleansing campaign.
The army swept through Java, looking for communists, stirring people up, and they came upon many peasants, and the soldiers would say, you're PKI, you're a communist. And the poor peasant farmer would say, what do you mean PKI? What are you talking about? And the interrogation would go on, and the farmer might say, oh, you're talking about those guys who came around and offered us seed at cheap prices. Oh, yeah, sure. We signed up with them, but that doesn't mean I'm PKI. I wasn't a communist. Those are just fellows who helped me out when things were tough. And certainly they did kill communists. They also killed a lot of people who were probably not communists.
Kalau dipuruki kan bur yang mati kepedil wonten lepen iki. Sore gawe ruangan anu nggih bur nggih. Ana sing sederek niku nggih akeh ning kula mboten ngerti. Wong giliran kok lesa wengi. Nek king Klaten wong edan, nek king Prambanan wong kulon. Nek elingan kula nggih antane 800-an nggih. Liwat.
The army was in complete control. You couldn't get 10 feet out of Jakarta without proper papers and permission from the army. After hearing reports of great slaughter going on, I was finally allowed to drive down there. At that time, there were 2 or 3 military trucks filled with civilians, families, men, women, children. And we were told these were communist suspects. This wasn't something I was supposed to see, but I can recall that day there were something like 2,000 people just in that one day being rounded up and taken to a central holding place.
One of the most amazing things was that you had a major, massive communist movement done in with weaponry and power and force that was contributed by the Soviets, which is, there's a tremendous irony in that, and we can't help but take a certain satisfaction in that.
In Yogyakarta, Ibnu Santoro's name is given to the army.
Jadi itu tepatnya adalah tanggal 10 November tahun 1965, ya. Kakak saya didatangi oleh 2 polisi militer, ya. Kemudian dijemput, kemudian dibawa untuk ke kantor polisi militer tadi itu. Terus kemudian pamit dengan istrinya sama anaknya dicium, terus kemudian sudah tenang aja. Saya mau ada urusan sebentar dengan pihak yang berwenang.
Ibnu Santoro is taken to this interrogation center, only a few hundred meters from his house. Here he is detained and tortured.
Kalau ditahan di situ, kemudian tiap hari dia datang mengantar makanan, minuman, pakaian, juga rokok. Setelah itu, kemudian setelah selang beberapa bulan, ya, itu kita mau ke sana sudah dikatakan bahwa Ibnu Santoro sudah tidak ada di situ lagi.
Ibnu is taken on a 4-hour drive with 22 others. One of Ibnu's fellow prisoners on the truck manages to write a list of everyone's names on the journey that day. He persuades one of the soldiers to draw a map of their final destination, which makes it back to relatives. Ibnu is taken to a forest near the village of Kaliwiro, where a hole has been prepared. Here he is shot in the back of the head. Seven weeks after the murder of the generals, Communist Party chairman Aidit is finally captured in central Java. He's forced to sign a confession and is then executed on General Suharto's personal orders. The once invincible President Sukarno is now powerless to prevent the wholesale slaughter unfolding in his country. General Suharto and the army now plan his downfall and the complete takeover of government. The military arms civilian death squads and supervises further mass killings. This man was part of a Muslim militia gang in East Java in 1965.
Sometimes, all the students were collected in a certain place and then instructed by a certain leader from the army, and they distribute to us a number of people, and ask us to kill them. So we know exactly that this is organized.
The U.S. provided secret financial assistance.
I saw many broken bodies and many pieces, torsos, legs, arms, floating in the canals. And this went on day after day, night after night. Hundreds of them.
Although there were several journalists inside Indonesia filing reports, the true story of a one-sided slaughter did not immediately reach the Western public.
I reported many interviews of catastrophic occurrences, but a lot of them didn't see the light of day in newspapers.
I wrote a daily file for Time magazine, and I also sent reports to the BBC and to NBC News. Most of my material was going through other journalists who were staff people in Singapore, and they would edit my stories, discard my stories, because they didn't believe them. It's incredible that they could second guess and kill my stories that I was gathering on the spot.
In the mid-1960s, at the height of the Cold War in Southeast Asia, stories that might engender sympathy for communists were not welcome. In this context, most newspapers and broadcasters reported the Army's death squads as engaged in a civil war.
There really was no sense that there was a centrally organized slaughter of alleged communists. It was being presented from all directions as a sort of running battle going on between, you know, organized communism and an organized army. It was a cleaning up operation. It was not a slaughter. The word slaughter didn't pass anyone's lips at that time. The scale of it was not understood.
On the island of Bali, the army laid the groundwork for communal butchery. Propaganda teams toured the countryside, spreading stories of PKI plans for women to seduce and castrate soldiers to obtain weapons. There was a deadly choice. You either took part in crushing the communists, or you were one of them.
I was told by General Sawa Eddy that whereas his boys, as he put it, had to encourage and stimulate the killing in Java, the killing in Bali was so intense that they had to stop it. They had to put a stop to it.
Di sini banyak sekali orang dipotong. Saya sendiri, saya nggak tahu, saya nggak sengaja bicara. Ketemu saya orang dipotong, saya begini. Nih kenapa anaknya sih salah, saya menangis, saya sama anak saya, baru saya nangis, kenapa nangis, nanti dipotong, tetangga saya digalaki, kenapa nangis orang dipotong, ketagihan potong, ya boleh saya potong.
Today, the tourist brochures sell Bali as an exotic paradise. They don't mention that 80,000 people were butchered here in the space of only 2 weeks. From the West point of view, the bloodbath had begun as an opportunity to see an end to Sukarno and the communists. Some news organizations outside Indonesia were instruments for broadcasting Western propaganda into Indonesia.
Of course, Radio Australia worked closely with the Foreign Affairs Department in Canberra and got advice or guidance, let's put it that way, got guidance from the department as to what it should say in its broadcasts. From time to time that guidance wasn't followed, but mostly it's true to say it was followed.
The BBC's reputation amongst listeners in Indonesia was high, and at a time when the Indonesian people would feel that they could not rely on their own media, they of course are going to be leaning on what they regard as reliable sources, BBC, Radio Australia, and so forth. I think there's no question whatsoever that we were all manipulated. I think probably the manipulation was being orchestrated by Norman Redaway, but I've no doubt that he too was also a part of an organisation in which the Indonesians played their part, the Americans certainly played their part.
Six months after the murder of the generals, hundreds of thousands of communists and their alleged supporters lay dead. General Suharto's troops surround Sukarno's palace, causing him to flee by helicopter. Later that day, President Sukarno is forced to sign a letter which hands the power of the presidency to General Suharto. Suharto immediately uses the letter to arrest 13 members of President Sukarno's cabinet and to legitimize the slaughter of suspected communists.
Jelas dan kita semua tahu
bahwa kekacauan dan ketegangan sekarang ini disebabkan karena PKI. Saya menggunakan surat perintah ini untuk membubarkan Partai Komunis Indonesia.
Kiranya SP 11 Maret itu satu transfer of sovereignty, of authority. Padahal tidak.
Despite President Sukarno's objections, General Suharto had effectively wrested control of the Indonesian state. His takeover was reported as a gentlemanly affair in the London Observer and welcomed in the New York Times, which hailed Suharto as a gleam of light in Asia.
I welcomed the Suharto regime, and most of the journalists did. It was the first time order had been seen in Indonesia for about 10 years. The Economist in early to mid-1966 started peddling the US line that Indonesia was safer under a disciplined rule. That certainly was true. It was safer. But to deny the level of destruction and the human tragedy that had taken place seemed to me quite idiotic.
The majority, I think, of the press was looking the other way. You know, there was no condemnation of it, I think. It was kind of tolerated and accepted. In fact, a kind of welcoming that Indonesia was joining the fold of the anti-communist movement.